Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're so glad to welcome you to our program tonight. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and distributed live stream. By entering this virtual meeting room, you give your consent to be recorded and distributed by Simeon Morrow Public Speaking and Presentations, Vienna Live with Simeon Morrow, and other third parties. If you prefer to not be recorded, please turn off your camera and microphone and/or go to the LinkedIn Live video feed, the link to which I'll now place in the chat room. For a better experience, please turn off your microphone and set your video to gallery view. This show thrives on participant contributions, and all participants are encouraged to actively participate in this webinar by asking questions and making comments. To do so, please either write in the chat room, raise your hand, or turn on your microphone to say hi, and I'll be delighted to include your perspective in the conversation. Tonight, our featured guest is University Professor Dr. Philip Auslander, Professor of Performance Studies and Popular Musicology at Georgia Tech. We are also pleased to be joined by Professor Lino Rivera of St. Mary's College of California. Among the literature we will discuss tonight is Professor Auslander's book, Liveness, Performance in a Mediatized Culture, the third edition of which was just released by Routledge. Professor Auslander, welcome.
Thank you.
Would you please tell us a little bit about yourself and how you became interested in performance studies and popular musicology?
Well, my background is in theater, primarily, and I became interested in performance studies because although my background is in theater, I've really always been interested in many other kinds of performance as well, particularly music, but not exclusively. And so performance studies seemed to me to be a sort of more expansive field than theater studies. And so therefore I was attracted to it. Yeah, I mean, that's basically it.
And can you tell us a little bit about this field? So we were speaking about just before we came on that I got to know your scholarship through an article you wrote in 2006 called Musical Persona, in which you contrast this idea of what we naturally have in acting as the persona on stage with a musician performing, and how that can manifest itself in different forms as a musician. So tell us a little bit about your research history, how you developed these studies and now are a so-called a guru, I guess you could say, in popular music.
Well, actually, that article is a good example of, in a way, to address your first question about performance studies, because the first question, because my background is in theater and I am also an actor, my first question really about any kind of performance is it like acting? Because acting is my default model for performance. And so that's sort of still within the theater realm. But when I started thinking about musicians as performers, which was something that I felt had not been adequately addressed either in performance studies or in music, I realized that, or at least I came to the conclusion that acting is not the best model for thinking about musicians' self-presentation on stage. And so I turned to the idea of self-presentation rather than acting, which comes more out of things you encounter in performance studies than in theater studies. So I was really trying to bring some of the tools of performance studies to bear on talking about musicians as performers, which, as I say, seemed to me to have been something that had kind of fallen by the wayside on both sides, on both disciplinary sides. And I've said many times that in terms of my research history, that I tend to write books that I want to read. And so a bunch of years ago, I wrote a book about glam rock, partly because I wanted to sort of use some of the ideas I've been developing about talking about musicians as performers, but also because at the time I couldn't find a good book on glam rock. So I thought, okay, this seems to be a gap. And also with Liveness, I mean, the origins of that book, which the first edition of which was published in 1999, really come out of my experience as an actor and theater scholar, where, as a person studying theater, you're constantly told how important it is that theater is a live medium and the liveness of it is crucial, but no one can really talk about what that means. So that was kind of where it started for me. It was sort of like, can we talk about this? And I couldn't find anyone in theater who was talking about it. Sort of, what do we really mean? What values are attached to this? That kind of thing. But I discovered that people in media studies, particularly television studies, have been talking about liveness for a long time. In fact, that's where the word comes from. So again, it seemed to me a place to kind of bridge a gap between theater studies or performance studies, and in this case, media studies, and to do something that it seemingly had not been done that I was interested in doing. So that's kind of been my the way that I go about things. But just to summarize, I basically work in three areas. One is popular music, the other is performance studies, and then the third is sort of performance art and art related things, because I also have a background in art history, and I have written art criticism for magazines and catalog essays for museums and that kind of thing. So that's another area that I'm quite interested in.
I think it's safe to say that's the crushing bibliographies that the reader gets are indebted to all of that scholarship, because you cite so many different authors from so many different fields. So it's very enriching and often all the time challenging. So Professor, we'll go back to the glam rock aspect of this in a moment, but I want to get to our first roundtable, which you so lovely introduced by what you just said. The roundtable is, quote, what does media mean in today's West, and what were, quote unquote, live performances before the advent of modern media? On page 59 of Liveness, Performance in a Mediatized Culture, Professor Auslander writes, quote, it is significant that the earliest use of the word live in relation to performance listed in the OED has to do with the distinction between live and recorded sound, not with the gramophone. The technology necessitating this usage was radio. This first citation of the word quote unquote live comes from the BBC yearbook for 1934 and iterates the complaint, quote, that recorded material was too liberally used, end quote, on the radio. Here, we can glimpse the beginnings of the historical process by which recorded performances came to replace live ones. But radio represented a challenge to the complementary relationship of live and recorded performances that went beyond its role in enabling recordings to replace live performances. Unlike the gramophone, radio does not allow you to see the sources of the sounds you are hearing. Therefore, you can never be sure if they are live or recorded. Radio's characteristic form of sensory deprivation crucially undermined the clear-cut distinction between recorded and live sound. It appears, then, that the concept of the live was brought into being not just when it became possible to think in those terms, that is, when recording technologies such as a gramophone were in place to serve as a ground against which the figure of the live could be perceived, but only when it became urgent to do so. The need to make that identification arose as an effective response specifically to radio, a communications technology that put the clear opposition of the live and the recorded into a state of crisis. The response to this crisis was a terminological distinction that attempted to preserve the formerly clear dichotomy between two modes of performance, the live and the recorded. A dichotomy that had been so self-evident up to that point that it did not even need to be named, end quote. So Professor Auslander, please tell us about the history of modern media and how quote unquote live performances didn't exist before modern media came into being.
Well, the statement that which is in that book and probably near the passage you read, that's gotten me probably into the most trouble in my life is something like the Greek theater wasn't live because there was no way of recording it, right? And so for me, the concept of liveness has no meaning apart from there being another possibility, another way of experiencing performances. And so in the absence of that, those events, there's no significance to calling them live, or that vocabulary had no reason for being because there was nothing to contrast it to. So live is only meaningful in relationship to something that is perceived as not live. So live versus recording, for example. That's the heart of that particular question.
Okay. And so tell us now then a little bit about that radio and then the television and this whole, it seems like this is something at that time you were very, very passionate about when you talk about state of crisis. So this is something that kind of, you had a live theater, and you even discuss in the book, I think in the preface, you talk about at a conference, someone, another colleague of yours saying, oh, you're the guy who hates recorded performances. So tell us about this. What does that mean then, this live, and what conclusions did you draw at that time about this state of crisis?
Well, at the time, I mean, that was certainly part of the original impulse behind the book back in, the 1990s when I suppose I started working on this. And at that time, I did kind of perceive it as a state of crisis. I mean, one thing that I mentioned in the book is there was a banner. This was in more than one place, but flying outside the Alliance Theater in Atlanta, there was a banner that said, "Not available on video." And to me, that just struck me as a very desperate thing, right? The only way we can sell live theater now is by saying it's different from video, right? And of course, that acknowledges that video was and remains, in some sense, the dominant experience. I mean, most people who experience performances of whatever kind experience them through media, not as live events. I mean, just that's a statistical truth. And so the question is sort of, what does that mean culturally or socially, or, what does that mean for theater and other concerts, theater, live media, live performance in general? But this is an ever-shifting landscape. And so, for example, one of the hugest changes that's happened is not so much in theater, but in music, where, for popular music, where for a very long time, the money in popular music wasn't selling records, and concert tours basically existed to promote the sale of records. They were not thought of necessarily as income producers in and of themselves. Their main purpose was promotional. But now that's completely reversed. You can't make any money selling recorded music. And so all the money in music now, I mean, not all of it, because there's a lot of other things involved, but to keep it simple, let's just say, and economists have actually studied this, that now musicians make most of their money from live performance, right? So these relationships are always changing according to, what's happening in the world, and also the development of media, et cetera. So these are not static things, and situations that I might have perceived in one way in the 1990s are not necessarily, they're not necessarily subject to exactly the same analysis almost quarter of a century later.
Professor, and can we take a step back to what you write about in the book in the beginning of this idea of recording a performance or of broadcasting a performance, that it was actually the camera had the best seat in the house, and the idea was that you were the camera sitting there in the best seat in the house looking at it, and that they were transporting it to a so-called home theater. Can you tell us about that, and how you said then that's how they developed even the three camera setup with the wide view, and then the mid view, and then the close-up view? Can you tell us a little bit about how that has developed and how that remains today?
Oh, it absolutely remains today. I mean, the thing that I was trying to get to in that, and this is a piece of the book that's been in all three editions and really hasn't changed because it's historical. And the history I was trying to recount is of the relationship between theater and television when television was a new thing. And a lot of people don't necessarily know this, but the television industry in the United States actually started before the Second World War. And then it was shut down, and then it sort of was revived after the war. And so most people think of television as a kind of post-war thing, which primarily it was, but there was a fledgling industry in the 1930s and early 40s. So I was actually looking at that to sort of see how people were trying to understand the relationship between the new medium and kind of existing cultural forms like theater. And long story short, it seemed very clear to me that television was being positioned specifically as an equivalent but better version of theater, of sports, of various other things. In other words, the message around it was kind of, why leave the house when you can have as good as or better experience of these things, of theater, of music, of sports, from the box in your living room. And so it really was positioned socially and culturally as an equivalent to live performance and a sort of better substitute for the experience of actually going to a live performance. And the impact of this was borne out economically. I mean, the theater industry took a massive hit. It had taken a hit from cinema a few years earlier, and then it took another hit from the rise of television because people, I guess, were persuaded that television provided the same, essentially the same cultural or aesthetic experience, but without your having to leave your house. And that seemed like a welcome proposition. Now, I do want to say that in the third edition of the book, I revisited this narrative and extended it, or not extended it, I revisited it in terms of the internet, because I wanted to look at the same question to see whether when the commercial internet was first being offered to people, if something like the same message was being sent. And I found out that in fact, in this case, it was different. That if you look at early advertisements, for example, for commercial internet service providers, they don't say, it's like going to the theater or only staying in your house, or you get the best seat. In fact, the way the internet was introduced was mostly to do with practical things that you could order stuff, you could buy stuff, you could find out stuff, you could get information, but it wasn't really pitched as an entertainment form at all, or as a kind of substitute for these other things. I'll circle back to this later in a different context, I think, but I just wanted to put it out there once again that, it's not the same story every time, right? So that was, to my perception, that was very much what was happening with television. That television really was positioned as an equivalent but better version of all these other things, whereas the internet was not. That was not the promise being held out by the internet.
Fantastic. And before I bring in Professor Lino Rivera of St. Mary's College of California, I just want to ask you to kind of illuminate a little bit this idea of the cinema as something that is recorded. It is a genre, that an art form, a media form that is of something that happened in the past. It's a story. But where with television, you're saying the crisis happened, at least in the second edition, because it's meant to be live. We are meant to be watching something
Right.
spiritually connected to other people who are watching at different televisions, whereas the cinema, we're all together in person.
Right. No, that's exactly right. And the thing about television, I mean, the way it was always pitched in the early days was you can see and hear things, see and hear, unlike radio where you can only hear, but you can see and hear things as they are happening, right? So one of my main points about liveness throughout all of these different versions of the book is that it's a moving target. It's continually redefined in terms of cultural form and technology and other things, right? So that, prior to television, maybe, or in what I call classic liveness is defined in terms of both spatial and temporal co-presence between the performers and the audience. But with television, you only have temporal co-presence, and yet that seemed to be enough to constitute a live experience. So already with that, there's a redefinition of what counts as live, right? Temporal co-presence is a sufficient condition for liveness, and physical co-presence apparently is no longer that particularly important in terms of defining the experience. And things like that have continued. I mean, it's like, as I say, it's a moving target. This was one of the main points I wanted to make always, is that, you know, liveness is not an ontological condition. It's not simply a given. It's a construct, and this construct is continually changing and is continually redefined in relation to other kinds of change surrounding it. So yeah, that's that was what I was trying to get out of that.
Fantastic. So before we move on to our next roundtable, let's bring in Professor Lino Rivera of St. Mary's College of California. Hi, Lino.
Hello, hello, Simeon, and hello, Philip. My comment and then a question. Recordings in music has influenced our perception and expectation of musical performance. We have had recordings of Vladimir Horowitz or Rubinstein, or even Sviatoslav Richter or Claudio Arrau, wherein there were imperfections in the recordings, and this is how we perceive the live performances would have taken place. But because of the advent of modern recording, wherein everything is very perfect, we tend to expect live performances to be as perfect as the recordings that we hear. So it, in a way, this is my comment, recordings shape our perception and expectation and experience of live performances when we go to concerts. Now, my question now is, because of the pandemic, performances were, and I have done this, streamed live. Our choir concerts streamed live. Our play performance streamed live. How does this affect, Philip, how does this affect our behavior, our experience, our perception and expectation of the live streaming, even in worship services? I mean, I play for churches and they say, half of the people don't attend church anymore, but they are on Zoom.
Right.
That's my question.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I was in the peculiar position working on the third edition of this book, of working on a book about live performance at a time when there was no live performance taking place. Because I was, you know, I think I first started working on this in 2019, but you know, really sort of got underway in 2020, and then boom, you know, suddenly no live performance. So I actually took quite a lot of interest in sort of looking around and seeing what people were doing to try to, in a sense, replicate the live experience online. And there were a lot of different things that people did. So anyway, just to say this, in the third edition of the book, I felt like I needed to acknowledge this and address this because it was part of the reality while I was working on it. But at the same time, I didn't want this to become the pandemic edition of the book. I didn't want that to be the dominant thing. So there are actually two sections of the book that are sort of clearly marked as this. I'm talking about the pandemic here, right? Without trying to make that the whole story. So one of these sections is about things that, not just in music, but certainly music was a dominant place where this happened, of things that people did to try to sort of replicate something like a live experience online, which is a bit different from simply from doing it on television. And one of the things that I actually personally is not so much live streaming, which, I mean, for me, in a lot of ways, watching a live stream is not that different from watching a live TV, let's say. But it is interesting just how extensive the practice suddenly became of everybody live streaming, you know, musicians live streaming from their living rooms, or, you know, et cetera. But one of the things that I actually found really interesting was not so much live streaming as the repurposing of recorded events as live, right? So as live events. So, for example, the National Theatre, you know, in England did this, and they've had a program called NT Live for a very long time. which had originally to do with streaming performances of their plays to movie theaters. And opera has also, this has also happened in opera. And so in the process of doing this, they also record the plays. And then during the pandemic, a lot of these presentations, opera and theater and so on, were presented as live streams with some of the trappings of liveness, even though they were in fact recorded, right? So I mean, a simple, what I mean by trappings of liveness, a simple case would just be making it available for a limited period of time, right? So, you know, so that you don't catch it this week, too bad, it's gone. You know? So it gives it some of that sense of ephemerality and evanescence that live events are supposed to have. There was a very elaborate, I don't want to, I could talk for too long about this case, so I'm going to try not to. But there was a very elaborate case undertaken by a small theater in Chicago who managed to record their play just before they had to shut down. So they couldn't, the run of the play never really happened, but they had a recording of one performance. And so they presented this online, but you know, you had to buy a ticket for a specific showing, right? A specific time, specific day, specific time. You could not pause, you could not rewind, you could not fast forward. You had to experience it in real time, right? They only sold as many tickets for a stream as there were seats in the theater. And they also had a little video at the start where someone greets you and offers to take your ticket from you and so on. So they really tried. Some of the reasons for this were not aesthetic. Some of them have to do with labor unions, but I'm not going to get into that. But they really tried very hard to replicate as much as possible, you know, kind of what it would have been like to go to the theater, right? In these various ways online. I found that really interesting, just to sort of see the different range of stuff that was happening, where people were trying to find ways of replicating that experience of live performance through the internet.
Just one final comment. Thank you for that. I think it's not going to go away, even if we're over with the pandemic and totally normal. I think this is here to stay. Zooming, worship services, concerts, plays, performances. I think it's here to stay. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but that's my perception of it.
I think you're probably right, at least to a degree. I mean, I do see now, you know, of course, things are sort of going back. You know, Broadway has reopened. You can go to see plays in New York. You know, rock bands are touring again. So, I mean, a lot of stuff is picking back up. But at the same time, I do think that people have sort of gotten used to doing things from their home. And also, you know, certain kinds of advantages, like for disabled people and people who don't have good access to these kinds of things, the advantages of doing them online, I think, have become very clear. And so I think for that reason, yes, a lot of stuff is still going to be happening that way as well. I agree with that.
Okay, so let's move on now to our second roundtable, quote unquote, live performance then and now. So this has a lot to do with, the first part has a lot to do with the video we saw at the beginning of Milli Vanilli lip syncing. And then when the record ran into problems, it was clear it just kept repeating itself and they were looking stupid there on stage. And so they just ran away. So we're going to talk about that. Please, I ask you to be patient with me. This is a long section I'm going to read. So this is the same chapter, first from the second edition of the book and then from the third edition. Let's take a look at the different perspectives offered by the former and current editions of Liveness on pages 109 to 110 of the second edition, published in 2008. Professor Auslander writes about a crisis of live performance authenticity caused by mediatization, writing, quote, the sociologist Jean Baudrillard points out that, quote, when the real is no longer what it used to be, nostalgia assumes its full meaning. There is a proliferation of myths of origin and signs of reality, of secondhand truth, objectivity, and authenticity. There is an escalation of the true, of the lived experience, and there is a panic-stricken reproduction of the real and the referential, end quote. I believe we witnessed these varied phenomena in the wake of Milli Vanilli. I am thinking primarily of two developments: the renewed emphasis within rock music on acoustic performance, of which the television program MTV Unplugged was the apotheosis, and the multiple awards given to Eric Clapton at the 1993 Grammy ceremony. These two phenomena overlap significantly, since the recording for which Clapton won his awards was the live album derived from his acoustic performance on MTV Unplugged. The plaudits heaped on Clapton in the spring of 1993 signaled a complex confluence of institutional and cultural discourses, e.g., the National Academy of Recording Arts and Sciences, rock ideology, television, some of which previously had been mutually antagonistic. The result of this confluence was the recuperation of rock's ideology of authenticity for a simulationist cultural economy, end quote. Yet, in the current and third edition of Liveness, the urgent writing about a crisis of authenticity disappears, and in its place is an overview of the debate about performers' ineluctable embrace of new technologies to create their live performances, and how that has affected what the philosopher Stan Godlovich calls creditworthiness in performance. On page 107 of the third edition, Professor Auslander writes, quote, "Synthesizers, once seen not as musical instruments, but as machines that had no place in rock, came to be seen as just another form of keyboard instrument. This development illustrates a process by which, as the sociologist Sarah Thornton wrote in 1995, musical, quote, technologies are naturalized by enculturation. At first, new technologies seem foreign, artificial, inauthentic. Once absorbed into culture, they seem indigenous and organic," unquote. Professor Auslander then juxtaposes Thornton's view with Stan Godlovich's, and vibraphonist Gary Burton writing, quote, "Stan Godlovich addresses the question of computers as musical instruments very directly. Quote, computers are not musical instruments, as keyboard synthesizers clearly are, nor does the use of sequencing software commonly used by dance music DJs constitute playing of any sort. The remoteness of control bears no likeness whatever to the elementary agency of performance," end quote. Professor Auslander continues, quote, "Other commentators have opposed new instrumentation on other grounds. It is somewhat ironic that Gary Burton, a preeminent vibraphonist who helped infuse jazz with rock instrumentation and timbre in the 1960s, was resistant in the early 2000s to the idea of teaching turntablism at the Berklee College of Music, where he was a longtime faculty member and administrator. He expressed a doubt even after signing off on the idea, quote, I wasn't in favor of it, and I'm very skeptical even now. It just seems to lack a lot of the musical elements that are important to me. You know, rich variety and harmony, varied dynamics, and more interesting rhythm combinations," end quote. So, Professor Auslander, please tell us about writing and then rewriting this chapter of the second and third editions and why they are so different.
Okay. Well, first of all, I just want to share a thought. When you would say you wanted to play that Milli Vanilli clip, I was this is a little bit beside the point, but I'm going to say it anyway. One of the things I started to think about was the fact that, you could look at Milli Vanilli as a kind of hybrid performance, right? Where you're combining one set of people's voices with another set of people's bodies. And the point that I want to make is that in other contexts, this is completely unproblematic, right? I've never heard anyone object to the fact that, for example, Darth Vader in the Star Wars movies is made up of one person's body and a different person's voice, right? And in Indian cinema, this is a regular practice with the singing voices of different people and the physical bodies of other people. And even lip syncing, I mean, there are types of performance in which lip syncing is considered a highly refined and valued skill. So all I'm trying to say is that all this is highly context dependent, and that specifically sort of in the context of rock ideology, that something like Milli Vanilli is a problem. In other contexts, it's not necessarily a problem. But the reasons behind that chapter of the book is the one that changed the most between the second and third editions, and it's really almost almost entirely different thing. And one of the reasons for this was very simply that the original version of the chapter was really addressing kind of rock culture and rock ideology specifically. And I just don't think that rock music has the same kind of cultural dominance or presence as it did, especially when I was first writing the book. So I kind of felt that that was feeling to me a bit out of touch, you know, that to sort of keep insisting on using rock music as kind of the primary thing to talk about, because I think it's been eclipsed. The other thing that sort of played into that as well is that in the original versions of the chapter, I had kind of triangulated live performance, recording, and music video. And music video status has also changed. It hasn't become any less important. I think it's just as important, or possibly even more important. But it has become decentralized and deinstitutionalized. So there's no more MTV, you know, there's no more VH1, there's no more sort of central programming of music videos. It's now dispersed. I mean, all artists make videos, but they send them out themselves on YouTube or whatever. So it's a very, very different situation in terms of the relationships among those three things. But the other thing that really kind of is really probably the main motive behind the changes in the chapter, besides wanting to move away from rock music, and first of all, to try to get a kind of broader perspective on the relationship of live performance and recording in a few different genres of music. So I talk more about classical music now than I did in the earlier times, a little bit more about jazz and so on. But the other thing is this concept of creditworthiness, because I think that, yeah, I'm just really interested in the way in which sort of the idea of what constitutes musicianship is shifting, or seems to be shifting. So in place of rock, I really wanted to talk more about electronic music, both as art music and as EDM. And in both of those cases, the interesting questions that come up, which are reflected somewhat in the passage you read, you know, have to do with does the real-time manipulation of sounds you did not make constitute musical performance, right? And to me, that's a really interesting question. And you know, I think in some, I don't like to use the word crisis anymore, but I think in some circles, you know, you could hear Gary Burton, for example, there. It is kind of a matter of crisis, right? That the very idea of what constitutes musicianship seems to be changing. And the way that I talk about it in the book is from a paradigm of skill to a paradigm of control, right? That musicianship now, at least in some contexts, in some circles, there seems to be a notion that the fact that you are controlling, in some sense, sound, right, is sufficient to consider you to be a musician, even if you don't possess any of the sort of traditional skills that are associated with musicianship. So that to me, that particular configuration of live and not live, and the insertion of the not live into the live, and the live manipulation of things that are not in themselves live, that to me seemed like a much more interesting thing to try to grapple with in today's world than sticking with good old rock music.
Fantastic. So, of course, I wish we had more time to go into this rock music and the authenticity and the idea that the person producing the sound is the authenticity of that music. When that person should not be faking anything. The person playing the guitar, strumming in a certain way, that sound that comes from that should make the authenticity. We will hopefully speak about that at another time or after this roundtable. This is our last roundtable. Which quote unquote live performances have been left unchanged by modern media? On pages 144 through 146 of Liveness, Professor Auslander writes, quote, "The foregoing analyses show that the so-called pre-recorded videotape trial, or PRVT, fought in an inevitably losing battle against a fundamental premise of American jurisprudence, that a trial is an ontologically live event. The hurdles placed in the way by using depositions, the emphasis on presenting live witnesses, the definition of testimony as a performance of memory retrieval in the courtroom at the present moment of the trial, and of availability in terms of the witness's ability to undertake that performance, all demonstrate the centrality of this premise. The legal system has no aversion to incorporating representational technologies into its proceedings, but accepts only incursions of mediatization that do not violate the liveness of that trial. It should be clear that this respect for liveness is ideological and that it is rooted in an unexamined belief that live confrontation can somehow give rise to the truth in ways that recorded representations cannot. The assumption that liveness equals truth is highly questionable. Advocates for the PRVT made the point that testimony taped before the trial may be fresher in the witness's memory and therefore more accurate than what the witness recalls at trial. While logical, this claim misses the point, which is that the essence of testimony is not the information recalled, but the performance of recalling it in the courtroom before the accused and the jury. In this context, the replacement of the trial itself by a videotape is simply an impossibility. The PRVT trial tape becomes evidence that functions that should take place in the courtroom at the time of the trial have already happened at the wrong time and in the wrong place. Ultimately, the advocates of the PRVT themselves acknowledged that liveness is fundamental to jurisprudence, end quote. Professor Auslander, please tell us about the centrality of quote unquote liveness to American jurisprudence.
Okay, this is a big topic, but the way that I actually got into this was through, and in the book, a lot of the material about this is geared toward this, is through intellectual property law. Because I just became really intrigued by the fact that under American law, a live performance per se cannot be copyrighted. And so I thought, and that was kind of the beginning point of my poking into all this. And in the course of poking, I also discovered that equally interesting to me, besides intellectual property law, was the rules of evidence and the rules of courtroom procedure. And this whole idea that testimony is the retrieval of a memory, in the courtroom, comes from that realm. And then there are lots and lots of other, interesting things that intersect with some of the other parts of the book or other things that we've actually talked about here. For example, having to do with virtual performers and sort of what are they in terms of intellectual property or anything else. By virtual performers, I mean, for example, CGI figures in movies, or those so-called holographic performances by deceased musicians, and things of this sort. But the crux of the whole thing is that, and this has been sort of on the way I've looked at it since the beginning, is that it's sort of remarkable to me that the one place, I mean, here I was writing this book, especially the first edition, saying, oh, look, live performance just doesn't seem to have the value that it once had, that it's been sort of overtaken and eclipsed by recording, by television, by all of these things. But the one place where it seems to retain something like its traditional value is in the legal system, where there remains this kind of idea that the way to get to the truth is through live confrontation in the courtroom, and that there is no real substitute for that, right? And so, just to be clear, the PRVT is a kind of slightly obscure, although to me it's surprising that it's slightly obscure, chapter in American legal history from the early 1970s, when there was a judge in the Midwest who was very, very excited about the idea of doing, the PRVT stands for pre-recorded videotape trial. And so the idea of this is that you would put all of the elements of the trial, all the testimony, cross-examination, this kind of stuff, you would record these on videotape, right? And the videotape would then be shown to a live jury. Actually, the jury would still assemble together in a live space, watch the tape, and then make a determination. And there are ostensibly many, many advantages to this. It made the process more efficient. The passage you read mentioned some of the other advantages attributed to this. But the ultimate problem, and it did happen, I want to say, there actually were a lot of these trials done, mostly in the Midwest, and mostly not criminal trials. There are only a few criminal trials, and mostly civil suits that were done in this way. Or very low level misdemeanor, kind of things. But it did happen. But it kind of, it was sort of fizzled out after a while. And the reason for this, which is alluded to in that passage, is very simply that there is in the American Constitution what is called the Confrontation Clause. And the Confrontation Clause guarantees you the right to confront your accusers in the courtroom. And so the question ultimately becomes what can count as confrontation? Does confrontation have to be a live encounter between two people, in the same space at the same time, or is there some kind of virtual equivalent of that? And as of right now, there is no virtual equivalent of that as far as the American legal system is concerned. And so not too surprisingly, this is another thing that came back during the pandemic, right? When you couldn't have courtroom trials. And so I won't go into the technicalities of this, but it was possible to do a certain limited number of legal procedures online during the pandemic, but not trials. Only things like appearances before judges or grand juries were actually done that way. But no trials. There's still this idea of the idea came back. I mean, people in legal circles were debating it. Can we do this? We can't do it in the physical courtroom right now. Can we do it online? And so it came back. It was debated once again. It didn't happen. There were no trials conducted virtually during the pandemic. But it's for that same reason, having to do with this idea of confrontation and whether there is any possible sort of virtual equivalent of looking someone in the eye. That's the phrase that always comes up in these discussions: looking someone in the eye and having and confronting them and getting to the truth that way. So right now and forever, the American legal system does not believe there's any possibility of doing this other than through a live event.
Fantastic. So as we move into our final section, I'd like to ask all of you, the participants, to think about any questions you might have and write them in the chat room, or turn on your microphone, say hi, and we can get to that. I will pose the first question to Professor Auslander. We've just discussed some of the many ways that our modern concept of liveness has been changed by modern media. Why have you published a third edition, and what should those of us here today, as well as the general public, be on the lookout for?
Well, I think the big takeaway for me, if I was trying to sort of figure out, kind of one main point that I kind of came to from the process of writing the third edition, is that, and this has something to do with my discussion of the internet in the book, is that I think overall what has happened, or perhaps is happening, is a shift in the idea of liveness from the liveness of the event to the liveness of the audience, okay? Which in a sense is a shift from the idea of a spectator to the idea of a user. And I think that that there's a drift, if you like, in our current thinking about audience, about the nature of audiences' participation and engagement, and therefore about liveness, from sort of the idea that you are there to watch something, as opposed to an idea that you are intervening in something. And it doesn't matter so much whether the thing that you're intervening in is itself live. The point is that you are live and your intervention is taking place in real time. And that's where liveness, I think, is now starting to be located, more than in the liveness of the event or the performance and your interaction with it. So, I mean, I know this is a kind of silly example, but something like an escape room would be a perfect example of this, where it doesn't matter if there's any actual lie, like you may hear voices or whatever. It doesn't matter if those voices are being produced by live people or not, right? What matters is your live activity within the context of the space, your solving of the problem, your navigating of it, all these kind of things. And that's where the liveness of an event like that resides, not in the trappings of the space, the elements of performance that are involved, and so on. And I do think that is actually related to expectations derived from our experience of the internet.
Okay. Any questions? Anybody? We have Professor Auslander here, ready to hear your comments, answer your questions. Anybody want to write anything or turn on their camera?
Well, how can there be questions? I mean,
He's answered everything.
that's right. It's all taken care of. It's all solved.
Great. Oh, here we have John V. I have a question about the idea of community and digitalization versus liveness. John V.
I can ask on, can you hear me? Yay, okay.
We can hear you.
So thank you very much for your book. I learned of your book when I was in my grad studies, and my advisor was telling me about, oh, you're analyzing, so I study Russian hip hop. Oh, you're analyzing this musical genre that's supposed to be made in this community setting. And what are the implications of that you're quite literally pulling apart the liveness factor from the musical factors. And I'm just curious about how community can be made, is made, can't be made via digital communities that share musical space. Even, for example, Little Nas had digital kind of virtual reality concerts. So none of the participants know each other, but they're sharing a space. And is that kind of a virtual liveness? Is that a kind of 21st century idea of liveness, or does liveness still rely on face-to-face contact?
Well, that's a good question. I think yeah, I don't know. I can't really say I have a very clearly defined answer to that, because I think about a lot of different things. So for example, one of the things that I was thinking about in relation to kind of observing what was going on in performance through the internet during the pandemic is sort of, for example, just to go back to the theater case that I mentioned earlier, where they only sold as many tickets as were in the theater. So you knew that you were one of 90 people watching this thing, but you couldn't see those other 89 people, right? You had no sense of their actual presence. And there certainly were other things that, other approaches to this that try to sort of compensate for that. So like, the ubiquitous watching parties, where people could gather together and watch a film or something together and then chat with each other during it, online. So there you do have kind of a sense of the presence of those other people, right? And you're actually interacting with them in a way you probably wouldn't in a live setting, right? Because it's not usually appreciated if you're holding these kind of side conversations in the middle of a film or whatever. But at the very least, that the presence of chat alongside the performance that everyone was watching, or the film or whatever it was, at least gave you a sense of the presence of those other people, and kind of a bit of a sense of community in that sense. So I think, I guess my question would be more, I'm not going to dismiss the idea and say, oh no, you can't achieve that kind of sense of audience presence or community online. Yeah, maybe you can. I think to me, the more interesting question is how, right? How would you go about doing that? So, I mean, if you're, Second Life used to be a big thing, and there were concerts in Second Life, and you send your avatar and there'd be a virtual band performing and so on. So does seeing your avatar, hanging out with other avatars on the screen and attending a performance, does that give you that kind of sense of community and connection? I don't know, but I'm saying, I'm not dismissing the idea that it can be done that way. I'm just asking, what are the means of doing it?
Fantastic. So, and John V replies, interesting, the knowledge that you are part of a collective, even if you can't interact with them. And Teresa Smolek writes, TikTok is a virtual community where users share music and remake it. 1980s music is a big comeback among Gen Z via TikTok. My daughter and her friends started singing Pass the Dutchie last spring, which originally came out in 1982 by Musical Youth. Thank you very much to John V. and to Teresa Smolik, excuse me if I mispronounced your name, Teresa, for your questions and comments. So let's see how we can stay in touch with Professor Auslander. Here is his, how we can get the book, first of all. That's very important. So it's out now. It was just released the last day of December, the 3rd edition. Here it is. And it's available on Routledge for $42 US. And I will put that in the chat room there so people can purchase it if they like. And let's see also then how we can stay in touch with Professor Auslander. So here it is, if I can figure out how to get to it. There it is. Here is his website. And so, Professor Auslander, people can reach out to you by going to the contact. Is that right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm easy to find. If
So
if you
there
want
is,
to,
there's
I'm not
all of
difficult.
Professor Auslander's information. You can get him at auslander@gatech.edu. He is happy to field your questions, hear your comments. So there, I will put that also there in the chat room. And so, and excuse me, and Jess Applebaum also has a question comment. Sorry, I didn't get to this quickly, but I'll offer this question and thanks for the talk. With the 3rd iteration of Liveness, you also bring forward the liveness of scholarship. How can the concept of liveness translate to the world of the academy? What might we learn from the connection, Professor Auslander?
Well, thank you. That's a good question. I actually, in the preface to this book, I talk about something that may be slightly related, which is that, having worked on 3 different versions of this book over almost 25 years now, I've sort of come to think of it as, in a sense, a never finished thing, right? And live in that sense. And this is kind of thing that's continually changing and evolving. I mean, the topic itself lends itself to that, because, as I said, liveness is a moving target. What it means and what it is and what its contexts are constantly changing. So the book has to, in a sense, has to change along with that, because that's just the nature of the topic. But yeah, I did kind of like this idea of liveness as not so much a book, but an ongoing and unfinished project that, I could conceivably, if I live long enough, just keep coming back to and coming back to and coming back to. And I like that idea in terms of scholarship. I don't know if live is the right word, but maybe living, that, the ideas that you publish at one point are, they're there, they're real, they're solid, but, you might change your mind. I mean, I've published a number of things that are actually refutations of things that I published earlier, or corrections, or so it's this kind of ongoing dialogue with myself, but not just with myself, with all the people who talk to me about these ideas, etc. So yeah, I think maybe the liveness of scholarship resides in thinking of scholarship more, not so much as the production of fixed objects that reflect a fixed opinion or a fixed analysis, but rather as a kind of ongoing flow of stuff that that can change, and that you can change as you change your mind about things, and be willing to admit that you can change your mind about things, or that you were wrong at some point. So I don't know. That's what comes to mind anyway. My mind.
University Professor Philip Auslander, thank you so much.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Now let's take a look at what's coming up next week on Vienna Live. Vienna's operas. Vienna, city of both serious and light music, of opera and operetta. Vienna was the music workshop of both Johann Strauss, father and son, and Richard Strauss, the legacy of which may be heard any matinee and or evening of the week at the Staatsoper, which focuses on opera, the Volksoper, which focuses on operetta, and the 3 quote-unquote united theaters, Raimund, Ronacher, and Theater an der Wien, which cover everything else, including hit Viennese musicals. Last year, Professor Michael Werber, member of the Staatsoper since 1975 and the Vienna Philharmonic since 1978, shared with us his father's tireless efforts to bring music to Vienna's devastated residents in the immediate aftermath of World War II. For this Vienna Live episode, Professor Verba will give us an exclusive introduction to the uniquely Viennese way to go to the operas. Once again, that is Vienna's opera, coming up next week. As always, all information about upcoming shows may be found at www.simeonmoro.com. Once again, thank you so very much to University Professor Philip Auslander. Thank you to Professor Lino Rivera. Thank you to Agnieszka and Benoit Rivolet for their support of this show. Most of all, thanks to you, our participants, who make it all worthwhile. From New London, New Hampshire, Atlanta, Georgia, and the Bay Area, California, goodbye, and see you next Wednesday.